Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation. My name is John. I am the tattooed historian, and it's wonderful to be once again with my great friend, Pete Carmichael, director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. How are you doing, Pete?
I'm doing great, John. John, I really liked the introduction. Jim, it's a new intro that John created recently, and yeah, I think it's nice. Well done.
Hey, you were saying we
drinking my watermelon seltzer water.
Nice.
It is
nice.
very, very refreshing, and looking forward to this evening's conversation and the opportunity to introduce my new colleague. Jim Vance is starting this fall at Gettysburg College. He will be the first Gilder Lehrman Professor of Civil War Studies. So it's exciting to have him on board. Many of you who are watching tonight know his work. He's an outstanding scholar. He's a really good speaker, and I'm excited for what our students are in store for. And I'm hoping that in a weak moment that I can get him to come to the Civil War Institute. He's presented twice, I believe.
Correct.
And he's been fantastic, immensely popular with the audiences. And I also like Jim because he just connects well with our attendees. He probably doesn't remember this, and I can't name too many names, but there was a panel about Reconstruction and teaching Reconstruction at the high school level. And one of the teachers asked a question. I think it was about using textbooks. One of our peers, a lovely person that I think the world of, gave an answer that was, let's say, almost impossible to decipher. And Jim immediately stood up and said, you know, this person sometimes speaks in code, and everyone laughed. And then Jim gave a really good and accessible answer to the teacher. So, you know, I'm looking forward again to having Jim as by my side throughout all of these things. The only thing I'm a little offended about, I already have my first grievance with Jim, is that he's going to have a bigger office than I do. And that's not right. Right? I mean,
Wow.
I don't even know if that's true, Jim. Yeah. Do you even know your office yet? I don't think you do you?
No, I don't.
Yeah, I didn't think so either. So, yeah. Because as you know, Jim, there is a long history at Gettysburg College that the Civil War historians get along exceedingly well. So we have to keep up that reputation, right? Yeah.
Fine.
So let me say a little bit about Jim. So as I mentioned, Jim's coming this fall. He's sort of currently at Connecticut College. He started his academic career. His undergrad was at Penn. And I was curious, did you have a class with Drew Gilpin-Faust or no?
Yes.
You did?
The Reconstruction to the South class.
Yeah.
Where I first encountered Eric Foner and Barbara Fields.
Yes. Excellent. And then from there, Jim taught at various schools, and those experiences, I suspect, had a profound impact on why you, again, today, find ways to make the past so accessible to general audiences. You follow, in a sense, of the footsteps of David Blight, who spent the first part of his career teaching high school in Flint, Michigan, which is a little known fact. And in fact, Blight said to me recently, he used to take his students from Flint, Michigan to Gettysburg Battlefield. And he said, I suspect that was the most important teaching that I've ever done in my career. You might have an interesting point there. So after you did some teaching, you then decided to go back and to get your PhD at Columbia.
Correct.
And his supervisor, or advisor, I should say, was Eric Foner, the noted scholar of Reconstruction. And of course, we've talked about Dr. Foner's work, including Free Soil, Free Labor, and Free Men. So you did your PhD under Eric Foner, and then you've already mentioned a historian that I'm deeply influenced by is Barbara Fields as well. So Columbia, you finished your PhD, and then now you were at Connecticut College for how many years?
14
years. Wow. Yeah, very long time. So I don't know how Jim reminds me of Aaron Chiandine, who's been on this show. They publish, and I don't know how they do it. The other thing that Jim does, again, I'm going to keep raving about him here.
Thank you.
He publishes for public audiences. He is very much a public intellectual. And what I really appreciate is that his sense of history, his respect for the past. I've never seen any moment in which he he has abused that in advancing any sort of current political agenda that he might have. And not all of our peers subscribe to that philosophy. Jim certainly does. I'd like to just mention one book, his first book, that was based on his dissertation, Sick from Freedom. Jim, we do a fair amount of show and tell in this show, don't we, John?
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Jim, unfortunately, you decided to go with Oxford University instead of UNC Press. Right. UNC Press books get a discount on our show because of my inside connections. But you know what, Jim? You don't need a discount to sell this book, do you?
No, I'm all right.
It sells itself.
Thank you.
It's an outstanding book. We're going to talk a great deal about that this evening.
Right.
I should also, though, mention that you've published a number of articles as well.
Right.
And again, you can obviously very accessible. But why don't we just go in? I'll get us started here, and we'll start meander our way to your book, Sick from Freedom. So here we go. I'm a Gettysburg College student, and I come up to Professor Downs, and it's after first walk. It's this wonderful tradition that we do at Gettysburg College, in which the first year class, before this begins, we all get together and we walk through town up Baltimore Pike, and then we go into the National Cemetery, and they are addressed by a speaker of note. The person, of course, recites the Gettysburg Address and then makes a few other brief remarks. It's a tradition that, again, is powerful, it's meaningful to these young people, connects them to that historic ground. And so a student comes up to you, Professor Downs, and says, you know what? Professor Downs, Lincoln got it right. He got it right in that very, very brief address. When he said new birth of freedom, Professor Downs, he nailed it. That's what this war is about. Professor Downs, how would you respond to Pete Carmichael, the student?
To Pete Carmichael, the student? It absolutely was a new birth of freedom, 100% period. I think that I would definitely underscore that point. The question that I would then have, or the point that I would bring up, is what is that process to freedom? And what did that road to freedom look like? And I might ask the student, what is their understanding of how emancipation unfolded? And oftentimes students have what I refer to as a shotgun moment of liberation, that enslaved people in the plantation South or scattered throughout the border states, anywhere, all of a sudden heard of the Union Army or were liberated by the Union Army and ran and were then free. And that's obviously true. It did in fact happen. But one of the things I try to explain in my book is what happens in the next 20 minutes, the next hour, the next day. How did formerly enslaved people find food? How did they find clothing? How did they find shelter? And what we have to remember is that when we talk about the Civil War, we have to remember that more soldiers died from the biological catastrophes of war and not from sort of battlefield deaths. So formerly enslaved people enter in a world that's pillaged by disease and destruction. And so without the basic necessities, they become more vulnerable to those illnesses.
So Jim, one of the books that I failed to mention at the onset is the book that you edited with David Blight. Now, unfortunately, my copy is on my Kindle, so I don't have a hard copy, which I need to get. But it's a wonderful anthology. It's fantastic. Right. And why this book, unlike so many other anthologies, and I've contributed to anthologies, and they're fine, but they fade pretty quickly. But this anthology is not. This anthology, Beyond Freedom, published by University of Georgia Press. Jim, maybe you have a book right there. Yeah, there we go. Again, edited by Jim and by David Blight. Jim has a piece in it as well. It's quite good. So this, again, anthology is one that will stand the test of time because it is an anthology that is a clarion call. And I was a little surprised about your response to student Pete, because in that book, and in fact, your own writings, it seems to me that you're more uncomfortable with this framing of Reconstruction as a moment of freedom. You've already helped us complicate it some, but can you sort of just broadly speak, and this, of course, addresses the anthology.
Okay, so
why are historians uncomfortable? I don't get it.
Okay, so let me just say this as a teacher and then as a scholar. So as a teacher, I mean, the worst thing I could do is to undercut the ending of slavery as a triumphant moment. And so the first response I would give would be to underscore the sort of Lincoln Proclamation. This book is an intervention. It's a scholarly intervention into a conversation that's already happening. So that if I'm having a conversation with my peers, I think we're already operating under the assumption that the ending of slavery was in fact a new birth of freedom. The question I think that this book really tries to raise is to really think about what that process of freedom was for newly emancipated slaves. And I think that in many respects, I mean, the way that it came about was that I was a fellow at Yale, and I was doing my research there, and I was meeting other fellows. I met Yael Sternhell, I met Carol Emberton, but at a different conference, I met Hannah Rosen. And I started seeing that there were these pockets of people who were being trained at the same time I was, that were coming up through the academy at the same time I was, and they had a different perspectives on emancipation. So I approached Blight about doing a conference that sort of brought together these new ideas as a sort of challenge to the traditional understanding of emancipation, which primarily centers political mobilization as the main plot. And so he agreed, and I then asked Greg Downs, no relation, but a very good friend, to help me organize the conference, and he did. So along with Greg and David, we brought together what is, you know, a quote younger generation of scholars who were thinking about emancipation and really trying to sort of qualify that periodization a little bit more precisely, to sort of think about emancipation as a distinct period, separate from slavery, separate from Reconstruction, and then to really hone in on those moments and those experiences and dig down and see what we found. And what we found are, you know, these moments of violence, which, you know, is both we found out moments of violence among and within the refugee camps for formerly enslaved people. We found, as I found in my own documents, my own records, the epidemic outbreaks. And so all of a sudden, this story that we have about slavery leading to immediate political mobilization seemed to need more clarification.
Could you, for our audience, real quickly, could you be very concrete about what you mean by political mobilization? And if you want to, you know, connect to a piece of older scholarship, I'm thinking.
Right. Okay. So
political mobilization.
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, I guess the best way of saying it is that, like, the first chroniclers of the Reconstruction period were a group of historians that came out of Columbia, known as the Dunning School. And basically what they argued was that Reconstruction failed because newly freed people were feckless, they were incompetent, they couldn't handle the challenges of freedom. 40, 50 years later, a generation of historians inspired by the Civil Rights Movement go back to that period, in large part inspired by W.B. Du Bois, who wrote Black Reconstruction. Du Bois wrote against the otherwise white supremacist narrative that the Dunning School put forward, and his voice was heard within historically Black colleges and universities and among very progressive circles of scholars, but mostly the Dunning School interpretation predominated the first half of the 20th century. You have a new generation of historians that are witnessing Black civil rights unfolding on the streets, and they start looking for an antecedent. And when they look for that antecedent, what they ultimately sort of uncover is that freed people were the major architects of emancipation. So when we think about today, we think about the 1619 Project, and we think about what Nicole Hannah-Jones is doing. And what she's basically arguing is for the 1619 Project, which is to sort of commemorate the beginning of slavery in Jamestown this past summer, this past August, was what she was arguing was that Black people embodied the notion of democracy. So that we have this theoretical, philosophical idea of democracy that comes out of the Enlightenment, that's very important, it's very interesting. But on the ground, it's the Black freedom struggle that begins in slavery and continues to the present that embodies that moment. So what happens is historians start looking for threads that connect contemporary political activism to earlier moments. And they find a thread in the Reconstruction period, which is really important, that the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, in fact, all result from grassroots Black political mobilization. That is to say, Black people on the ground fighting for rights, working with Republicans who were then the allies of freed slaves. And that led to this massive transformation. That is true. However, you and I are living during a pandemic. You and I are living in a moment that's not broken into silos. We're living in a moment where we're seeing what's going to happen in November in the context of a major epidemic. Our lives are sort of interwoven with this sort of political uncertainty, with the uncertainty of the epidemic. And what I was trying to do in Sick from Freedom was highlight that uncertainty, because what we had seen for so long was just the political narrative. It would be like telling the story of 2019 and 2020 and only looking at Trump, Biden, Bernie, and not realizing, wait a minute, there was also a pandemic. So the book, and I think the effort of this period and of this new generation of historians, is in many ways trying to explain the complexity and the nuance of this period.
It's fantastic. Well, John, I've got some other questions from your response, but John, go right ahead.
Jim, I was wondering about going back to Beyond Freedom for just a short minute here. I was wondering about what your thoughts are on the Freedmen's Bureau's records for those who want to conduct the research about that era and that particular movement of people after emancipation, the assets that are involved in that record set, and the possible ways that that can be misconstrued for the issues you just highlighted. Right.
So what's really exciting is that in the 1970s, in the 1980s, that group of historians, those historians who were inspired by the Civil Rights Museum, uncovered in the National Archives a treasure trove of records that were collected, documented by federal officials known as the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau is a fascinating organization. It's established in 1865 in response to what we refer to as the transition from slavery to freedom. And what they do is they establish four major divisions. They establish a land division to sort of rethink, what are we going to do with this land? They establish a labor division about how are we going to return formerly enslaved people to the South to plant the profitable cottonseed. They established an education division, which at the time was quite unprecedented in terms of public education. Public education efforts in the 1860s were limited. They were local. We didn't have a national public education system. So they were going to set up schools in many respects to help formerly enslaved people in this transition. And they established a medical division. So when these historians saw these records, they were like, this is proof. Here's the testimony of formerly enslaved people talking about how they were the main political actors in the reconstruction of the nation. What's so great about it is that the government creates a bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy captures the testimony of these people. And as I write in my piece, many Black voices make it into the National Archives through a white pen. So a freed person, a man and his family, would come to the office. They would describe their conditions. They would write about it. We would then have the record of it. So in many ways, this was so exciting, and it answered all of these questions about gender, about marriage, about labor, about politics. And we thought we had the entire story. And then when I looked at the records, I thought, we have a really biased version of the story.
So Jim, I think this is, so we do have one of the documents from the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay. And I would love for you to be able to give us what you think would be the sort of the traditional interpretation, or maybe a better way of putting it is, where did the eye go, right? Before you looked at those documents and you raised some very different questions about those documents. So the document is you
want to put it up?
Yeah, it is a letter to O.O. Howard, I believe.
Oh, okay.
There you go. I don't know if you can
I can blow it up a little more if you'd like.
Yeah, probably need it a little bit bigger.
Let's see if I can stretch that out here for a second for you.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. That's good.
There we go.
I feel like this is my oral exams. Is this? This is not the one I sent you the charts, but I'm happy to do this. I'm happy to do it. No, I'm happy to do it. Okay. So Committee on Freedmen on Edisto Island, South Carolina, to the Freedmen's Bureau Commissioner. Okay. So what is the first sentence? I can't read it. It's
so with painful hearts that we, the committee, address you, have thoroughly considered the order which you wished us basically to sign. We wish we could do so, but cannot find our rights safe if we do so. So it's focused on rights, right? General, I think it's like homesteaders, we were promised homesteads by the government. If it does not carry out the promise, its agents to us, the government having concluded to befriend its late enemies and to neglect to observe the principles of common faith between self and its allies. In the war you said was over, now takes away from them all right to the soil they stand upon, save such as they can get by again working for your late, and they're all enemies. If the government does so, we are left in a more unpleasant condition than our former. That paragraph does a lot. So,
right.
Jim, tell again why that paragraph again was both startling to historians, and now you're saying, no, wait a minute, it's in the whole story, right?
Okay, so this is like, Pete, I love this. Like, this is like actually like harder than an oral exam because I haven't seen this document. Now I'm on live. We're asking me to analyze it. So I will. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do my best. All right. So look, here's why it's important, because it's signed by freed people, right? So that's the first thing. So the first reason why it's important is because we have this conception, one, of illiteracy, one that Black people don't understand how democracy and government works. So this proves that, one, they're versed in those ideas, two, they're literate, and three, they're making a very fair claim. More importantly, it's happening in October of 1865. So it's during Johnson's administration, and it's during this time when their promise, what you may have heard of as 40 acres and a mule, this idea that they're going to be given land. What happens is Edisto Island is right off the coast of South Carolina. It's part of the Sea Islands. This was part of what we call the rehearsal for Reconstruction. That is to say, during the war, the federal government doesn't know how they're going to get freed slaves to return back to the South. So they create this commission that goes into this place that brings military officials, teachers, and freed people together. So what happens is they're responding, they're putting together this argument in order to, in some way, make a claim for land. Now, it's interesting because it shows that they're not these sort of feckless, dependent people, that they're making a particular claim. What I would argue is they're also, what my point is, they're also presenting their petition within a particular political register in which their concerns would be legible. So they're not going to talk about, in Edisto Island at this time in October of 1865, a major smallpox epidemic has actually wiped out their population, leaving many of them dying. Instead, they have to promote this idea that they're able-bodied, that they're versed in what democracy is, and that they're prepared to work on the land. So it's a very curated kind of letter that they realize what they need to do in order to get what they want. Because if they start talking about the fact that so many of our people are dying, or so many of our people are suffering, or so many of our people don't have a place to live, then that's going to support the pro-slavery parable that they're better off in slavery. So there's this argument about them trying to promote a kind of political autonomy.
So, and Jim, and then I'll turn it back over to John. I think that your piece in Beyond Freedom, it deals with this topic that you've just explained very well.
Right.
It's really, really good. And it made me feel like the old fogey that I am, because that EDSO document was, for me, kind of it was the entry point for my students to understand that at the very heart of Reconstruction, that it must be reduced to a problem of labor. And that very word that I used, reduced, I think reveals how limiting, right, my approach is. And so all this has been very beneficial to me to think in a more complicated way. But now it leads to a question to you, Jim, and it's a question, it's an important one. because I think it's one thing that my students and our audience are going to benefit from greatly. And here it is. These documents, and I don't care if it's this or any other source, does it give us an unmediated view into the past? Like, you looked at that document and I'm thinking, man, that just tells us what they're thinking. But you're a cultural historian and you think about the depiction of events as they're put on paper. You think about them differently. Help our audience and our students understand why you just don't get a document. You never feel comfortable with the document. You're always sort of interrogating and going at it. Explain that to us.
So, I mean, yeah. So the way that I teach it is I always say that as a historian, we're social scientists. So that on one level, we bridge both the humanities and the sciences. But how we do that is sort of, it depends on each historian. So that is to say, we have a method, like the science, like the hard science, like biologists, like chemists, like physicists. But then how we employ that method is much more like the humanities insofar as we can do it artistically and creatively. So I always, when I teach a document, I always say there's the intended meaning, which is exactly how you describe the document. And then there's the unintended meaning. So the first thing I always say is like, all right, so what is the intended meaning in that document? And it's everything that you just described. But then getting at the unintended meaning, I'll ask different questions. What is the genre of the source? Who is the audience for the source? What is the date of this source? All of those questions open up a new way of rethinking and reframing that record. So, I mean, on one level, yeah, I mean, so I think that let me just, for some of the people in the audience that might know a little bit about the history of slavery and the history of emancipation, we have tons of interviews of ex-slaves who lived during the Great Depression. And that was in large part because, exactly what's happening right now, because of the pandemic, because of the economic downturn, all of these people who are artists and writers and so forth are without work. So the federal government employed them, sent them to the South, where they recorded and told these stories. So similarly, we have an encyclopedic sort of collection of records known as the WPA records of these ex-slaves. Historians have been very critical of both the ways in which those documents can illuminate parts of the past and the ways that they can limit the parts of the past. And tons of historians have written about it. We haven't applied a similar analytic to the Freedmen's Bureau. We've accepted them purely on what is the intended meaning. And the question becomes, why did a document like this continue to exist? Why was that particular document preserved? And in part, it was preserved by Republican members of Congress. It was preserved by people who either came out of the War Department that were part of the Freedmen's Bureau, or out of the Treasury Department, which was the Department of Negro Affairs. And they used it as proof of the fact that Black people were prepared to meet the challenges of freedom. The stories that Thavolia Glint, the noted historian from Duke, talks about in terms of the refugee camps are examples of Black men committing sexual assault on Black women. That's not something that people in this period want to record or remember. And so as a result, Glint's essay is a brilliant, breathtaking meditation on what we don't see and what we can't see. And so what I'm thinking about always is we're seeing a particular notion, a particular vision of Reconstruction, but it's been highly curated. And we've been so excited to rescue that image because it shatters the racist interpretation of Black people as independent, but we haven't then seen it as its own construction. We just keep using it as evidence to undermine an earlier racist interpretation. So it's not to say it's not true. It's not to say that it didn't happen, but it is to ask the question of what are they talking about? What are they not talking about in that record? And why does land and labor become this sort of the sort of framework in which their petition becomes legible?
It'll be tough to pry me away from that framework entirely, which we could talk about at some point, because I still think that's important. And you're certainly not the issue here. I just want to quickly say before I turn it back over to John, Jim, on Monday we had Carolyn Hawk on the show.
Yeah.
Student here, and she discussed her work on Benjamin Butler. She opened with an article from a New Orleans paper. It was Confederate in its sympathies, and it led with a story describing a poor white woman, that her face was scarred from smallpox, described her clothing as well. Didn't give her a name, of course, but using her to illustrate in essence, a fallen woman who no longer was respectable. And as we discussed with Carolyn, I think what you're getting at as well, is that with a source, to me, the goal was to discover its truthfulness. That no longer is my prime concern, in fact, at all. In fact, I think I've made that turn, as other cultural historians have done, and that is just what you have said. Why did those editors in New Orleans create and manufacture, very likely, the story of this poor woman? What was the intent? What was the purpose behind it? And then I'll give another example of this. William Johnson, with African-American soldier who was charged with not rape, but some crime of sexual violence. He was convicted. He was then executed. He received the noose. Marcena Patrick, a Union provost marshal, made this a grand spectacle. He invited at least 2 photographers, maybe 3. They took many photographs of it. One of the photographs became a woodcut and was featured in the New York Times. I've gone through every single Richmond paper. And let's quickly note here that Johnson's hanging took place in full view of the Confederates, who mistook the hanging that they believed initially that it was a Confederate spy who was getting the news. They quickly informed the Confederates that was not the case. It was a black soldier. They, of course, stopped firing. So it was seen by thousands of Confederates. Front page, or not front page, but a main story in the New York Times. Every Richmond paper, from July all the way into the fall. I found one article mentioning Johnson, and it was 3 lines, copied from the New York Times. Now, of course, I came to this thinking this is going to be a propaganda field day for the Confederates. I won't bore everyone here with my explanation as to why there's a silence. But, Jim, I think what you've spoken to and what your article speaks to and what I now press my students to consider are the silences.
Right.
People said to me, well, how in the hell can you interpret a silence? Well, you interpret a silence by understanding that there is calculated decisions that's being made. And the people who make that decision, who ensure that there's that silence, that's a reflection of the power they have in that moment. I think that, again, how you've approached these Freedmen Bureau papers, it certainly has opened up my eyes. And I think it's a healthy way to get people to use that overused word now, but to truly interrogate these primary sources.
Right. So can I just, in the spirit of the popular hashtag cite black women, can I just say that, like, my analytical approach here was not of my own invention. It came out of being an undergraduate at Penn, working with Farrah Griffin, being trained through African-American literature. And so what African-American feminists did in the 80s and 90s was to find the silences of the representations of Black people within literature. And so that is, you know, if you look at something as classic as Shakespeare's Othello, like how can we talk about representation? How can we talk about even feminist critics? How do we talk about the representation of the wife of Bath and Chaucer? There's already an analytical tradition and framework to do this kind of work. I was just using that and applying it to these records. So I always say that that's an example of interdisciplinarity, because they've already talked about how to do this. Like, we don't need to invent how to research and uncover the silences. There's already a huge literature on it. We just need to cite that these critics and these scholars who actually spent their careers doing it in other places. So I think that's,
and I should also say I really hate to say this, but I will. It's a little bit of an age difference between us, right? Yeah. Because I didn't know anything. What you just said, and I read it in your piece as well, and I heard you speak about it. Hell, I didn't have any kind of training.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just kind of sort of stumbling along. I mean, it's one reason why it took me 10 years to write a book, because I was so unsatisfied with the sources. And like you, I felt that as much as I love James McPherson's For Cause and Comrade, the emphasis on duty and on agency, I thought it overlooked the coercive presences that shaped how these men lived their lives on a daily basis, but more importantly, it shaped how they depicted and wrote about them. And so I wasn't trying to suggest that these men didn't have a sense of duty and that they were patriotic, but there's so much underneath those words that we need to be able to recover.
Right. So, and let me just, for our audience, let me just say this, and as a teacher, if you read Darlene Clark Hines' essay on Dissemblers, it's very simple. It's just, how do Black women in the 19th century, enslaved women, present their sexuality? And they create a particular image because they don't want to be the Jezebel. They don't want to fall into these stereotypes. If we could all, then when we work with Black women in the records, we can all just think and apply Darlene Clark Hines' conception of dissemblance to the representation of these Black women, we won't see them purely as the way in which they're represented, but we would begin to see them and understand them as engaging in a practice of dissemblance, that they're projecting a particular image. So it's like, the best example is The Help. You know, you watch The Help, it's like, yes, ma'am, yes. Well, look, she's performing in a kind of manner because that's part of her, the only way she's going to be economically, successful. That's a performance, and so that's important to say. How is that happening in your record? Just ask the question.
Have you, and again for our audience as well, this is a book that helped me a great deal, Silence in the Past. Have you read this one?
Yeah, of course.
You've read everything, of course. Yeah. I don't mean that.
No, I mean that.
This was a great book.
You're turning this into my oral exam. Did you read this? Can you read that?
We grilled you for your interview here. This is a lot tougher than an interview, right?
This is actually more rigorous. I'll go.
John, I'll let you take it away here.
Yeah.
I want to highlight a comment which I think really is awesome to see from our viewers, and that is from Dan, that it's so cool to watch historians analyze documents in real time. Because we often don't see this, and it's kind of awesome to be able to talk about documents in new ways, or how we perceive the documents when we look at them and such. And we often just see a bunch of talking heads on live streams pontificating about what they've learned, but we don't actually get to hang out and check out documents together. And I think that's a really important thing, because I'm learning. Yeah, I've learned from Pete. I've learned from others, obviously, of how to look at documents differently than I looked at them in undergrad. And or from high school, and I'm learning different ways. And I'm glad that some people are getting that as well through these live streams. It's not just a really cool intro and some guy with a paper hanging on the walls. It's as important for everyone to understand how to research.
I think, John, tomorrow we have Erica. He's one of our students as well. And I believe, John, did she send you a bunch of pages from Cyclic and his part? It's an overlooked not by a Union soldier. And so I think we're going to give her, she's going to go through her pre-orals on tomorrow, and we're going to give her a chance. Although she's getting to pick the documents. I didn't get to surprise her. I think that's a surprise.
Yeah, she'll be ready for grad school after tomorrow. Definitely. But Jim, I would like to ask something about blame. And I see this coming up once in a while, especially with Sick from Freedom, when you're talking about the smallpox epidemic, and how some people, meaning freed people, are often their plight is ignored, or whites are treated different than freed people are. But then it becomes, as you've pointed out, the black epidemic, and it's like blaming a certain race or a culture on this issue. Right. And it kind of reminds me of the parallels with today. Sometimes we hear it being emulated today again, and that's just the way that it rolls sometimes. As sad. Right. Would you like to touch on how that came about with that smallpox epidemic reaching its heights, and we see the different views of looking at it as far as treatment, but also blame?
Right. So I guess the best example would be, maybe we have we have progressed since the 1860s. That is to say that many people have highlighted the irony that most essential workers today are people of color, and yet the most concentrated areas of people of color are seeing the highest rates of COVID-19. And so there's obviously a relationship between the spread of an infectious disease and the political economy. So I think that most people have been able to at least recognize that. They're not seeing this as like, some sign of inferiority, although I'm certain that on the internet it's circulating. In the 1860s, they lacked that nuance. In fact, going back to Pete's example of the woman from New Orleans who was considered a fallen woman, that's often code for women, that are sometimes sexually promiscuous and then they become sick. That's often considered they contracted smallpox in some reason because it's God's punishment for them having sex outside of marriage. So that's a concept. That's how people understood the spread of disease in the 19th century. So when smallpox begins violently spreading among the free population, few people, some doctors in Washington, D.C., some Black activists like Harriet Jacobs, the famed author of Incidents of the Life of the Slave Girl, some white women allies, recognize that it's a result of this abrupt transition from slavery to freedom. They realize that the high infectious rates are due to the fact that that freed people don't have anywhere to live. And when I say they don't have anywhere to live, that's not hyperbole. That's not like, they don't have anywhere to live. It's just a shoebox. These people are found dead on the country road. They're found dead in abandoned fields. They're found dead in deserted barns. They had nowhere to live. They were lucky if they were able to get a worn, torn tent as a shelter. So the epidemic spreads because they don't have the basic necessities. And then it sort of plays into all of these understandings of Black inferiority, that they're more susceptible to disease and so forth. And so they blame them on being crowded together, never realizing that it's the result of the fact that they don't have access to basic necessities. They don't have an opportunity to get a job. One of the terms that I found in the 19th century, it's so interesting, and it's coming out today in disability studies. It's called able-bodied. Able-bodied, again, to read that term, to analyze that term carefully, always had a gender connotation and meant men. Able-bodied never meant a woman.
No, never.
In the 1860s, okay? So this is also part of the transition from the agrarian economy to the industrial economy that leaves so many people as marked as, quote unquote, to use the 19th century lexicon, destitute or dependent. This happens during the war and the immediate aftermath. That is to say, the government will aggressively recruit Black men to both work as construction workers, laborers, soldiers, but it leaves all of these Black women and children without economic opportunities, and thereby they become most vulnerable to those infectious diseases that plague the Civil War South.
Did you ever find, just following up real quick, and I can turn it over to Pete, with that rate of people dying and not having places to live and such, did you ever find your research the proponents of those who call for gradual emancipation saying, see, I told you so, we should have done this gradually, or anything like that?
Yeah, so DeBow's Review, which is a Southern agricultural magazine that circulates before the war among planters, basically they argue, they're not on the abolition side, they're on the pro-slavery side. They say, we told you so. And we told you that these people weren't going to be able to live on their own. We told you that they needed white people to instruct them. We told you that they could never be independent. And so the disease and the epidemic sort of, becomes proof of Black inferiority. Now, I think this is really important in light of COVID-19, because when we think about COVID-19, we think of it purely in terms of like, what is the sort of epidemiology of it? How does the virus work? What is the pathophysiology? Is it infectious? Is it not? Blah, blah, blah. Okay. The bottom line is COVID-19 unfolded during a very tense political moment in the United States. It did not unfold within a political vacuum. So when we see people going towards Trump's side or going in the opposite of Trump, that we think on some level that's particular to our moment. That's exactly what happened during emancipation. That the smallpox epidemic did not happen in a vacuum. It happened during a very politically contentious time. So how people understood it often depended upon which side of the ideological fence they stood on. So they and here the abolitionists and many of the champions of freed slaves downplayed it because they were afraid that it would support the pro-slavery cause.
So again, we are thinking about COVID-19 today and how it's disproportionately affecting people of color. And you've made a very good point that meaning the people that are working in the food industry or service industry are people of color. You made in another talk, and I thought it was a really important point that you made, that we are encouraging everyone to stay at home. And oh wait, if you want to help the economy,
right,
get food for takeout, without of course thinking about what I'd say is not just the racial dimension of this; it's an important class dimension, right? That these people that are serving us, these people who are cooking food, they're all with great risk. And then of course they do what, as you point out in this other talk that I heard, then they come back home to a small apartment that they are in essence quarantined to, and of course putting everybody else at risk.
Right.
It's amazing to me. No, it really isn't amazing to me. Is the blinders that we all have, right? That I've gone downtown in Gettysburg and I thought, hey, I'm doing my good deed. I'm ordering out. And I guess on some scale I am doing that, but not thinking about the fact that I'm putting probably other people at risk. This all leads up to a question, and it compares today to Reconstruction. Some people have said to me that the problems of Reconstruction, they're overly racialized. And what they mean by that is that they are not, that the use of race as the explain all. Of course, I think to tip my hat here to Barbara Fields is a failure then to be able to see the class and labor dynamics that exist behind it. Do you have similar concerns about how we are describing the impact of this pandemic on people of color? Are we missing class here? And if we are, what can we possibly do about it?
I mean, I think there's a million things I could say to this. So, right. I mean, it's a facile. The argument is, they're putting out statistics based on race when, it's not, it's, you can't look at race without looking at class. And so, but what I would say initially is, and this is when I really start thinking, and I really, you talked in the beginning, the introductory comments about me about what is the important point of historical analysis in contemporary debates. And, it's interesting because I think that most historians would argue, yeah, it's good, it's important. But fundamentally, when it comes to life and death, people think that, historical analysis is important in terms of thinking about a Spielberg depiction of Lincoln. It doesn't really have any relevance in the middle of a pandemic. And quite frankly, I would disagree because, one of the reasons, and I sort of almost lost friendships over this, to be completely frank, is that when this idea of shelter in place and quarantine first happened, if you really go back to the early moments in March, people were they were afraid, but they were also taking it as a joke. Like people were like, wash your hands, like Gloria Gaynor, I Will Survive, or they watched Mariah Carey washing her hands. Like it was a joke. And I was freaking the fuck out because it was like, look, you can't quarantine poor people in isolated places. The epidemic is going to spread. But instead it was like, look, I've turned my garage into a workout center. My kids are making banana bread. I'm becoming a science teacher. Like it was so like not thinking about populations that are crowded together, incarcerated populations, nursing homes, public housing. I mean, those were the areas that you needed a historian to be like, or someone to say, this is a problem. The other thing is quarantine has been around since 14th century Venice is when it first came about. There was something called the International Sanitary Commission, which I talk about in my new book, which will be out in January. They didn't understand how disease spread. And so what happened was the International Sanitary Commission brought physicians together from all over the world. They met in Paris, they met in Constantinople, they met in Malta, they met all over. And ultimately, every time a pandemic broke out, they were like, quarantine doesn't work. I'm a doctor from Malta, doesn't work. I'm a doctor from Constantinople, doesn't work. I'm in Cairo, doesn't work. I'm in London, doesn't work. I'm in New York, doesn't work. Quarantine was seen as Byzantine. And what's happened today is a very, very messed up point, which is there's a difference between prevention and isolation. That is to say, if someone is infected with disease, then yes, if you quarantine a virus, it will stop it. But quarantine as a prevention protocol does not work, and it has not worked. And so then by quarantining people into nursing homes and quarantining people into low-income housing, that's the reason why those numbers spiked. And so I can't look at you as a doctor and say, this is how your body's reacting. But as a historian, I've studied quarantine. As a historian, I've studied what happens to vulnerable populations. As a historian, I've understood that there is the dominant narrative, which is banana bread and washing your hands. Isn't sanitation cool? Right. And then I realized what happens on the other side. Also, given the fact that it's a virus, I'm also like, I don't want to get into the washing. The washing of the hands, it's important. So I don't want people to walk away from it not thinking it's important. It is important. But the question is, during the Civil War, people believed in lots of sanitary principles that were not efficacious. Right. And you read those documents and you realize people just feel like they're doing something. So I watch people, I've washed my groceries. I've washed the bags. I had a friend of my mother's tell me that, well, they keep the bags in the other room for a week before they touch them. What do you... Even if a microscope proves that the virus is there on the bag, we're not convinced you're infectious. But you're doing something. And so you feel like it's working. You have no idea. That's a narrative, again, that we tell ourselves. So I think it's really important that historians can contribute to this discussion because it provides a more important context.
And so, we'll sort of circle back to, I think, my first question. And I'm thinking about also some of the descriptions of free people, descriptions you offer, are free people dying along the side of a road or in a barn, or African-American women getting raped. And I'm not suggesting that historians have not included those anecdotes as part of their narrative to their students about Reconstruction. Right. But here's my question. Are you worried at all that the stories of violence, they're so horrifying? And hell, we haven't even mentioned the Klan,
right?
And the paramilitary tactics used against Black people and some white people. Yeah. Are you worried about two things? First thing, are you worried that this is becoming almost sensationalized in what we are subjecting is not the right word, but what we are providing to our students, right? That violence is sensationalized, that they become almost hardened to it. That's the first thing. Yeah. And the second related point here, again, are you at all nervous that this book with David Blight, that I think that it is an important book, but is it going to turn us in the direction of the idea of second slavery? Maybe you believe in second slavery and Reconstruction. So there you have it, those two pieces.
Yeah, I mean, listen, man, I would say this. I would say a couple of things. I would say, I think about this all of the time. I think about what I teach in an intro level is not something I would necessarily say at a conference. I mean, these are two different things. So what I think you teach in an intro level, or maybe you introduce at high school versus what you teach in advanced seminar. I mean, I think it would be wrong if you're teaching, 16-week course from Reconstruction to the present U.S. history, and all you do is teach the violence of Reconstruction. I mean, I think that's problematic. Yes. But I would think that if you're teaching a course just on Reconstruction, then I think it's important, and you have 14 weeks to really dive in, then I think you need all of the other elements. I also think it's important to consider who your audience is. I mean, for that book, Beyond Freedom, I mean, my audience was to other scholars and and people who are sophisticated readers to say, we know the traditional story of Black political mobilization. And this is not to diminish it, and it's not to take it away. It's a primer to really get people to think about the kind of research that they're going to do and as a framework to interpret the sources. I wrote Sick from Freedom, and people, got attention, and we talked about the epidemics and blah, 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 blah. And then last year I was at a major Reconstruction conference, and it was like, back to business. Like, let's just talk about law. Let's just talk about politics. And no one was actually, no one was thinking about, well, how did these people engage in a day-to-day, how do they think about their day-to-day existence in the context of epidemic disease and violence? And so my book is addressed to them. Like, before we have another 400 pages on the 14th Amendment, could you at least understand that the 14th Amendment is unfolding in the midst of all of these other things, which does not take away from the 14th Amendment. In fact, I would argue, as I did, that many people became politically mobilized because they were responding to the health conditions, and that Black women in particular. I mean, this is the point that Danielle McGuire makes, and completely retold the history of the civil rights movement by saying, it's sexual violence against women that inspired Rosa Parks to not give up her seat. Parks interviewed Reese Taylor in the 1930s, who was a victim of rape, sexual assault. Yeah. And then in the 30s, but she couldn't get anywhere as an NAACP interviewer with Reese Taylor's case. Ultimately, when she gets on that bus, that's the legible, acceptable version of political activism. She can't scream, yell, and holler that Black women are being raped, but she can politely not give up her seat. McGuire has found that every place you see those mobilizations of Black women, they were there as a Trojan horse because of the sexual violence committed against them, but they couldn't say it. Deborah Clark Hine. Darlene Clark Hine. What is the narrative that they're going to present? The narrative they're going to present is, I look like a librarian. I'm a church-going woman. They can't talk about sex. They'll be marked as a Jezebel. What they can do is they can refuse the seat on the bus. So my point is that the civil rights movement undergirded by violence, but it's narrated as a story about segregation on the bus. Go back to the 14th Amendment. It's about political suffrage. That's the narrative. The document that you showed me, it's about land. Land is America. This land is your land. I know it's a song later, but what is the Jeffersonian Republic? Land. That's a legible concept that people can accept. But what got them to talk about land? Death, disease, and violence. So it's just thinking it through is what I'm saying.
I'd add a little bit, and of course I'm piggybacking on what you've actually read or written in other places. And I think it summarizes what you're trying to say. If our view of the past is one that's entirely just about power and the exercise of power, which I know you're deeply interested and concerned about as I am. But if it's just that, that's an impoverished view of human behavior, nature. And as you've written about, there's so many other elements here in the moment of Reconstruction that deal with, for example, spirituality. That didn't show up in the document that we just read from Edisto. Hell, we know that mattered. We know family mattered, and the list goes on. So I think
that's right. I think that's right. Yeah.
John, would you like to wrap it up with anything here? Because we might even have some questions or comments from our viewers as well.
Actually, there's a comment here from Lynn that's really good. How much has violence during Reconstruction spurred a migration precedent to the Great Migration North and West?
Right. So the answer is there's a great book by Nell Painter called The Exodusters, and it basically tracks these worlds, these communities of Black people. She has them leaving the South all the way and charts them going to Kansas. But if you even think about late 19th century Oklahoma, and John Hope Franklin talks about this too, there's lots of freedmen's communities that sort of develop, and they eventually dissolve and are eradicated by white supremacy and Jim Crow violence in the early part of the 20th century. But this is the world that Zora Neale Hurston tries to capture in Their Eyes Are Watching God, which is these sort of free Black communities that develop in the aftermath of emancipation.
Mm-hmm. She goes to Florida. Is that where she did most of her work?
Yeah, so that's that. She's in Florida. There's a bunch. John Hope Franklin has tracked them in Oklahoma. There's a footnote in Kate Mazur and Greg Downs's collection. I mean, not collection, but their National Park Service. The document from the National Park Service. They have a footnote that talks about the freedmen's communities as well that are in sort of Oklahoma during this period.
Well, Jim, I'll wrap up by just saying that, again, we're all so excited to have you as part of the.
Yeah.
Fortunately, you're coming, and John is leaving. I don't know if he told you. John is starting his PhD, and he's going up to Canada. And
yeah. Congratulations, man!
Thank you. Ontario bound. I'll send some Tim Hortons for you all.
I love Tim Hortons, man. I love a good donut.
Yeah. Jim, I'm especially excited because I'm quite certain that you're going to help our students think about this battlefield, Gettysburg, in a more expansive way, so that when they talk about the campaign in 1863 and why R.E. Lee decided to take the Army in Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania, I suspect that you'll have some important context as to what's happening on the home front, what's happening in the South, especially, again, when we think about the environmental angle that some of our other speakers have taken who have been on the show. And then also for your angle as well, that we see this great biological disaster that has engulfed the South. And so I think that you're going to help us all think about this place at Gettysburg in a way that we can bring voices to the forefront, that a lot of people, they come here. I'm not saying they hear the same old story. That is a myth. And that's unfair to my Park Service colleagues who over the last, I'd say, 15 to 20 years have done so much to enrich the interpretive experience here. They have done a brilliant job. And so, like I said, we're so looking forward to having you here.
Excited. I'm excited. Thank you.
All right. Take care. And so we got tomorrow night, John. What's again tomorrow night? 7 o'clock. Eric?
7 o'clock. We're talking about Cy Clegg and his pards tomorrow night. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Eric?
It's a great novel. It is... It's got great circulation amongst the reenactor crowd because it's fantastic on material culture, but it just gives you these glimpses of the war. And I think, as Jim has pointed out to us, glimpses of the war that often are not put on paper because these soldiers, they want to be seen in a certain light, right? And they're writing home. They want to be seen as the good old, right? They call them good soldier boys, right? Cy Clegg and his part shows a very different side of something. All right.
Looking forward to that. Thank you again, Jim, for being on. Really appreciate it. Congratulations. New position. Pete, thank you so much, my friend. And thank you all for watching. It's been great. Take care of yourselves. See you tomorrow night.